I want to get to the fallout from the Helsinki summit. We also have some breaking news overnight. The release of those 400 pages of documents related to the surveillance of Carter Page, who has served as a foreign policy advisor on the Trump campaign. Here's how the New York Times reports it. It says, visible portions showed that the FBI in stark terms had told the intelligence court that Mr. Page had, quote, established relationships with Russian government officials, including Russian intelligence officers, that the Bureau believed the Russian government's efforts are being coordinated with Page and perhaps other individuals associated with Mr. Trump's campaign, and that Mr. Page has been collaborating and conspiring with the Russian government. The president up already with a reaction, Congressman Schiff. He says this confirms with little doubt that the Department of Justice and FBI misled the courts. And then in a tweet, he says it looks more and more like the Trump campaign was illegally being spied on for the political gain of crooked Hillary Clinton and the DNC. Congressman Schiff, is that how you read the 400 pages?
No, of course not. And I think actually if the performance that we had in Helsinki took place before those applications were filed, I think that whole interchange with Putin would have been a central exhibit in the FISA applications. No, those applications set out in some detail, a lot of which unfortunately is redacted, just why the FBI was so concerned that Carter Page might be acting as an agent of a foreign power. And let's remember, that application and those renewals have been vindicated in substantial part by Carter Page's own words in a letter I think you asked him about, in which Carter Page acknowledged being an informal advisor to the Kremlin. But the information they had when that application was filed included the fact that Russians were dumping these documents, that the Russians had previewed the dumping of these documents with George Papadopoulos, that Carter Page had in fact been a target of Russian intelligence in the past, that Carter Page had gone to Russia during the campaign, that he had meetings with the Russian officials that Page had publicly denied, but we can now confirm that he did in fact have meetings with Russian officials. So it was a solid application and renewals signed by 4 different judges appointed by 3 different Republican presidents.
Mr. Bossert, do you see any evidence that the Department of Justice misled the courts or that this was illegal in any way?
Well, from what I saw and I read of what was released last night, the majority of it was redacted. So I saw no new information. I saw basically that they've affirmed what Congressman Nunes and Congressman Schiff have already released in their own memoranda, that there's been a reliance on materials that have been called into question, and that the court, in reliance on those materials paid for by some Democratic Party officials, it was worth looking into. Now, I think it's also important to remember looking into it is important because you don't want foreign influence, but that doesn't mean that Carter Page had any kind of role in the Trump campaign. From what I'm told, he was a nobody on the fringe. Well,
but he was an advisor to the campaign until he was let go in the fall of 2016. Let's move on now to the fallout from Helsinki. We just showed that clip of Director Coates. I assume both of you may have been there during that interview, or I know you've been out in the forum this week. Tom Bossert, the director said he meant no disrespect to the president, but you saw how surprised he was by this announcement. Does a second summit so soon make sense?
Yeah, so he was surprised by it in a lot of ways. I hope he knows a lot about our foreign intelligence, and I know he does, and it doesn't really matter as much what he knows about the president's schedule on that. But I think a lot's been made of that. I think it's been overblown. Dan Coates is a loyal patriot to the country. He's a great director of national intelligence. I think it's going to be a heck of a circus of coverage and so forth as President Putin comes here. And you saw him being a little bit lighthearted there. I don't take too much in that. I hope, though, when the president says the meeting will take place in the fall or autumn, that it's not right before the midterm elections, but rather after. I think that would be the intelligent way to proceed, and I don't think that he's ruled that out. The timing hasn't been set.
But you see no other reason to postpone the summit? You think a second summit now does make sense?
Well, from what I understand, and I can only rely upon what we're told, but from what I understand, President Trump's conversations in private with President Putin were productive. And they didn't agree on anything, unlike what's been reported by apparently the Russian government in a way to mislead us.
Well,
President Trump had a productive set of conversations.
That gets to
I think
one
it's
of the
important to continue them.
And I want to bring that to Congressman Schiff, because we have heard the Russians say that there were verbal agreements made, Congressman Schiff, that they were important agreements made. We just heard Tom Bossert say he was told that they... We haven't heard much else on the record from officials in the Trump administration.
Well, listen, I would agree with Tom that the talks in Helsinki were productive, but they were productive for Vladimir Putin. The reality is we have no idea what this president, our president, agreed to. That's an asymmetric advantage for the Kremlin because they do. The Kremlin intelligence agents know exactly what took place in that meeting. And the fact that Dan Coats doesn't, there's no failing on Dan Coates' part. The failing is that the president hasn't even described to his own intelligence chief what he may have agreed to in that private 2-hour meeting. Ostensibly, there may have been agreements on Ukraine, on Syria, and who knows what else. We do know that after leaving that meeting and coming back home, the president undercut our commitment to the collective security of NATO. Was that a topic of discussion, too? Did Montenegro come up? It is, I think, negligent with our national security for us not to know. George, as you know, we tried to subpoena the interpreter, and on a party line basis, the Republicans rejected it, some of whom talk a good game, but when it comes to defending the country, they're not willing to follow through.
Congressman Schiff, you've had some tough words for the president this week, calling him the gravest threat to democracy. Other Democrats have followed that up as well. Just bluntly, do you believe he's compromised by Vladimir Putin?
Well, I certainly think he's acting like someone who's compromised, and it may very well be that he is compromised, or it may very well be that he believes that he's compromised, that the Russians have information on him. We were not permitted to look into one of the allegations that was most serious to me, and that is, were the Russians laundering money through the Trump Organization? The Republicans wouldn't allow us to go near that. I hope that Bob Mueller's investigating it because, again, if that's the leverage the Russians are using, it would not only explain the president's behavior, but it would help protect the country by knowing that, in fact, our president was compromised.
Tom Bossert, we've heard that also from Chuck Schumer, the Senate Democratic leader, from Nancy Pelosi, the House Democratic leader. How do you respond?
Well, it's an easy, cheap shot to say the president's been compromised by the Russians. I think the Russians elected a former KGB agent, and he spends all of his time and their resources squandering it on penny-ante spy tactics to try to get into loser kind of lobbyist pockets and so forth. And this country elected a president that was a former businessman, and as a result, our economy is doing well, and we spend our time trying to have productive meetings with foreign leaders. All the rest of this speculation and smoke is meant to undermine the president. It's domestic, partisan, political concern mixed with some legitimate need to throw our intelligence forces against the prevention of spying and interfering in the United States, and it's just meant to conflate.
You say penny anti-spy tactics, but don't you accept that the Russia did interfere in a serious way in our 2016 election and the threat is still out there?
I do concede that. In fact, I've conceded that all along. But what we're talking about here today tends to be this Steele dossier and the Butina indictment and so forth, which is a little bit more penny-ante smoke. That's my reference. But interfering in our election system is unacceptable. I think the president believes that, too. That's just not quite the way we report it.
The Maria Butina indictment, Congressman Schiff, that he just mentioned, she, of course, was charged this week with being a Russian agent as well. Is that penny-ante?
No, of course not, and it's surprising to have someone with a Homeland Security background say that it is. Here you have someone acting as an agent of a foreign power, essentially trying to infiltrate the NRA, making contacts with U.S. persons, trying to establish a secret back channel. Again, we tried to look into allegations that the Russians may have been funneling money through the NRA, but the GOP found that too hot to handle. These are serious matters, and I think there's no ignoring the fact that for whatever reason, this president acts like he's compromised. There is simply no other way to explain why he would side with this Kremlin former KGB officer rather than his own intelligence agencies, why he would continually attack NATO. And again, some of those allegations in that much disparaged dossier talk about the give back from the United States, which would be undermining NATO, which would be revisiting sanctions on Ukraine, policies that unfortunately have come all too much to pass with this president.
Tom Bossert, final word for you. How should the president follow up on the summit this week?
Well, George, the place where I disagree with the congressman is that the president acts. No, he speaks in ways that people don't feel comfortable, but the way he acts is to impose the greatest painful punishments on President Putin of the last two presidents. That's a pain that President Putin feels. So I think what President Trump ought to continue doing is acting tough and talking in ways that advance the U.S. interests in the Middle East, China, and elsewhere around the world. The reality is we don't like Putin's tactics, but Russia is the largest landmass with 145+ million people and a lot of oil reserves. We have to deal with them in some strategic way to gain U.S. interests elsewhere in the world. So if he keeps acting tough, we'll forgive some. We'll forgive some of his. Some